Et donc, j'invite maintenant Madame Cael Cohen, titulaire d'un doctorat en philosophie de l'éducation de l'Institut d'études pédagogiques de l'Ontario de l'Université de Toronto. Elle est professeure au département de philosophie et d'éthique des affaires à la Sully School of Business, University York, à Toronto. Elle va donc nous donner une conférence intitulée « Le navire est-il la cause du sillage ou le sillage est-il la cause du navire ?» vers une large approche active du e-learning. Je peux vous donner la parole ?
Presentation. Two things before I begin my introduction. First, I legally changed my name in June 2015. So my birth name, as you see here, was Diane Zorn. So my thesis here is under that name. So just to clarify that some of my publications before the name change are under that name, and the more recent ones are under Cael Cohen. And second, please feel free to email me should you wish to follow up on anything or reach out to me. Moreover, if some aspect of my presentation interests you, I welcome opportunities for collaboration. So I'll begin with an introduction and a quotation from Pema Chodron, an American Buddhist nun who lives on the east coast of Canada at a monastery there. Quote, "This is where tenderness comes in. When things are shaking and nothing is working, we might realize that we are on the verge of something. We might realize that this is a very vulnerable and tender place, and that tenderness can go either way. We can shut down and feel resentful, or we can touch in on that throbbing quality. When things fall apart and we're on the verge of we know not what, the test for each of us is to stay on that brink. The only time we ever know what's really going on is when the rug's been pulled out and we can't find anywhere to land. We use these situations either to wake ourselves up or to put ourselves to sleep. Right now, in the very instant of groundlessness, is the seed of taking care of those who need our care and of discovering our goodness." Educators are in this shaky instance of groundlessness right now. COVID-19 suddenly forcing education fully online, challenging demands of the I-generation digital learners, paradoxes and possibilities of social media and advanced internet technologies, the dire need for critical thinking and ethical disagreement skills, and threats to democracy have brought education and online education to the brink of everything that it has been, while forcing confrontation with its not yet. This groundless place of discomfort and promise plants seeds for fostering deep learning and social change. The theme of my presentation, what my presentation is all about, the big takeaway, is this: a broad enactive approach has the potential to radically transform the theory and practice of e-learning, but there's a catch. The catch is, one, I believe this can only happen if the current enactive approach in education is significantly broadened. And two, this can only happen if educators practice teaching and learning against the habits of inattention inherent in the culture of higher education that prevent an enactive approach from flourishing in North America. And this will be difficult, given that these habits of inattention are mostly emotional, with emotional stakes. Okay, so just a couple qualifications. First, I suspect the second point about the culture of higher education may also be true of the culture of higher education in Europe. However, I've only studied the North American context. And second, this second point may also be true of high school and middle school and grade school. However, I've only studied the higher education context. And by radically transform, I mean that a broad and active approach to e-learning enables deep learning, genuinely engages both educator and learner, and promotes growth. Growth in the way that John Dewey uses the idea to refer to the meaning of life. Growth in the form of educating for social change and self-other transformation. The hidden premise or unstated assumption of my presentation that I will not be discussing or defending is that this radical transformation needs to to happen. I would require another presentation to explain how e-learning is not currently living up to its potential. My focus will be on the potential of a broad enactive approach to radically transform online teaching and learning. My aim is to suggest in broad strokes a framework for future research on enaction and e-learning that intertwines theory and practice. This is the agenda of my presentation. And my presentation is really in three parts: possibilities, problems, and practices. And I see the movement towards a broad and active approach to e-learning as moving sort of from possibilities through problems to practices and back again. And I see this as, to use the spiral term again, this is a kind of active spiral. So to begin, I would like to begin by inviting you to participate in a thought experiment or an imagination exercise that shows the potential for a broad and active approach to radically transform how we understand phenomena or existential events. Consider a question, a puzzle that Alan Watts explored. Watts was a Zen Buddhist scholar who popularized Buddhism in the West in the 1960s and 70s. He raised this question in his later talks, in which he reconsidered Zen with a small group aboard his houseboat in Sausalito, California. Imagine a ship gliding peacefully through the water. Trailing behind the ship is a wake, a line in the water formed by a small wave. It is a sunny, clear day with a beautiful blue sky. Perhaps there are some seagulls flying overhead. Does the ship cause the wake, or does the wake cause the ship? Most people would readily answer the former, the ship causes the wake, based on a widely held classical view of causality, time, and space. That's on the left-hand side of this slide. If one infers the ship caused the wake, then causality and time are understood as linear, and space is viewed as a container. In contrast, one who presupposes a broad and active approach would argue that the wake caused the ship as much as the ship caused the wake. In other words, a broad and active approach helps us to see in what sense the wake can be said to be the cause of the ship. Allow me to explain. According to the classical view, for the ship event A to cause the wake event B, cause and effect are established using the common criteria of temporal priority, spatial connection, correlation, and reasonable mechanism. First, the ship must come before the wake in time or be nearly simultaneous with it. This temporal priority criterion presupposes that the ship passes through the water in linear time from the past to the present to the future through T1, T2, T3, and so on, creating the wake in the process. Second, there must be a spatial connection between the ship and the wake. The ship, water, and wake must share the same space, where space is understood as a container that holds the separate entities, ship, water, sky, cloud, and birds too. Third, the ship and the wake must be correlated, mutually vary together in this space. Finally, a reasonable mechanism must be identified, showing how the ship caused the wake. The explanation is that the ship, a solid body moving through the water, a fluid in linear time, impacts the water, a cause-effect relationship. The classical view unwittingly presupposes a mechanical model that requires seeing each of the parts of this existential event, the sky, water, ship, clouds, and birds, as distinct from each other and operating separately upon each other. In contrast, a broad enactive approach sees causality as circular or reciprocal, what Thompson and Varela, drawing on emergence theory in science, called upward and downward causation. Thompson and Varela explained it in this way in their 2001 article entitled Radical Embodiment, Neural Dynamics and Consciousness. In the journal Trends in Cognitive Science, quote, This is in the journal Trends in Cognitive Sciences, quote, "We propose a more expansive two-way account using the tools of dynamical systems theories. We suggest that as a result of the generic feature of emergence in complex systems, one can expect there to be a two-way or reciprocal relationship between events. Finally, a broad enactive approach views space like a trampoline, a metaphor that Jesse Rogerson used in conversation with me. Rogerson is an assistant professor at York University in Toronto, where he teaches astronomy and planetary science. Space bends to make way for the various positions of states and features of the dynamical landscape, understood relative to each other. As Thompson described in Mind in Life, quote, "Part and whole co-emerge and mutually specify each other." The focus is on where states are rather than what space is made of or contains. My aim in considering the question, does the ship cause the wake or the wake cause the ship, is to suggest the transformational power of a broad enactive approach. We may just as well have considered an alternative question with similar results. Am I the cause of my footprints trailing behind me in the snow? Or do my footprints cause me? A broad enactive interpretation of this existential event changes everything. By understanding this event anew as a complex dynamic system, rather than seeing it in unwittingly mechanical terms. Likewise, the Zen Buddhist or quantum theorist might interpret the event in a similar fashion to the enactive approach. A broad enactive approach of this event takes an ecologically holistic turn that changes everything by understanding the event as a complex dynamic system, a unitary structure, like a weather front, rather than distinct processes unfolding through time contained in space. So an enactive view sees the wake as the cause of the ship as much as the ship is the cause of the wake. Or my footprints trailing behind me in the snow can be seen to cause me as much as I cause them. I would like to shift now from imagining possibilities to discussing problems. I need to begin by very briefly explaining what I mean by a broad enactive approach and how is it different from a narrow one. So I understand a broad enactive approach. I use the term to be defined by the three origins or roots of the enactive approach and the three interrelated theses. And Sebastian talked all about this in detail in his presentation that opened the conference. And if you didn't get a chance to see that presentation, you need to watch the recording. It was so helpful and exceptional. So I'm also seeing a broad enactive approach in this way. And of course, the embodied mind and mind in life, I see as paradigmatic examples. So I see these three origins and roots as necessary conditions for what I'm calling a broad enactive approach. So the three origins or roots of a broad enactive approach are, of course, cognitive science, dynamical systems theory, and two phenomenological traditions. The two traditions are European continental philosophy and Buddhist traditions of mindfulness awareness. So from these three roots, we see what the enactive approach is. So the enactive approach is coming out of cognitive science as a theory of mind, coming out of dynamical systems theory as a kind of emergence theory, and it's coming out of these two phenomenological traditions as a method of examining human experience. And the three interrelated theses of a broad enactive approach are here. These are taken from this journal article here. I've tried to put a little book whenever I refer to something. So this is 2001, Evan Thompson, Empathy and Consciousness. So the three interrelated theses are embodiment, emergence, and self-other co-determination, or dynamic co-emergence. And this was discussed in much detail at the beginning of the conference. So what about the distinction between a narrow and a broad approach? Well, I see the broad approach as grounded in all three of these origins and interrelated theses. And a broad approach, we see the broadest approach of all is, I think, the most paradigmatic is Evan Thompson's Mind in Life book from 2007. So we see that he presupposes an enactive view of matter, evolution, information, causality, time, space, consciousness, emotion, and life. I also see John Dewey here as having a broad enactive approach, and in particular, his book, How We Think and Experience and Nature. And in my PhD thesis in chapter 3, I argue that Dewey's philosophy can be characterized as a broad enactive approach. Now, what about the narrow approach? Well, first of all, I'm not suggesting in any way that what I'm calling the narrow approach is mistaken or misguided, not at all, just that it's a limited focus compared to what I'm calling the broad approach. And I'm going to explain in a minute why I even bother with this distinction in terms of the enactive approach in education. So the narrow approach I see as being grounded in one or two of the three roots, and it's a matter of focus. So focusing on maybe one of the interrelated theses or two of them. So a limited focus might be very specifically on perception or cognition. And I like the example of Don Eide. I see Don Eide's work. I wrote my master's thesis on Don Eide's philosophy of technology, and he was my second reader on my master's thesis. And I very much see his philosophy of technology as enactive, but a narrow approach. And here are some of the books here that I refer to. So why bother? Why am I bothering with this distinction in the context of the enactive approach in education? Well, while the enactive approach was broadening in cognitive science, and we see that, there was a special issue that came out in Phenomenology in the Cognitive Sciences in 2006, where the introduction was written by Steve Torrance. And there in his introduction, he notes this difference between a broad and a narrow approach there. And then the sort of landmark in between that special issue on enaction, enactive cognitive science, and today's conference is, I see Evan Thompson's book, Mind in Life, which broadens the enactive approach so very much. But at the same time, the enactive approach in education was narrowing. So the enactive approach in education has, for the most part, been reduced to a complexity science view. And I believe and argue that the potential of a broad enactive approach in education has yet to be realized. So here's, I see the enactive approach in education as having two phases, a broad phase and a narrow phase. And they eventually run concurrently and exist in the literature at the same time. But here's a little timeline to show you. The context I'm talking about here is North America. So the enactive approach in North America, we begin over here on the left-hand side with the embodied mind coming out. And this is the cover that I'm familiar with, when it first came out. And in 1993, this person here, Brent Davis, he delivered a paper at the meeting of the Canadian Society for the Study of Education in Ottawa, Ontario, in Canada. And his paper was called Toward an Ecological View of Mathematics Education. This paper is really launches the enactive education, enactive approach in education really gets launched with this delivery of this paper. And Americans who are in the audience listening to his paper take this back, and they begin to start working on an enactive approach in education. The same year, Brent Davis and two of his colleagues, their names are here at the bottom, found something called the Enactivist Research Group. This is at the University of Alberta. So the enactive approach doesn't begin in the US, it begins in Western Canada, and that's where it comes from. So Brent Davis really leads this research group, and he becomes the leader of the enactive approach in education in North America. And Thomas Kieran is the PhD supervisor for David Reed. Now, Thomas Kieran, although he says what he's doing in 1993 is an enactive methodology, that's how he describes it, Actually, he's not really doing that. He's doing constructivism, and that's very clear to me that that's what he's doing, but he calls it that. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later when I talk about what I see as the continuum between self-action, interaction, which is really where constructivism gets placed, and inaction. So I don't see inaction and constructivism as completely the same. Whereas in this conference, some people have used the term constructivist and constructivism interchangeably with inaction, but I see it on a continuum. So I'll show you that continuum in a bit. So then things start to really develop. So Brent Davis comes out with his book, and there's a small group of people are publishing now, and this is the area that they're publishing on here at the bottom of my slide. So teaching, learning, cognition, qualitative research, quite a bit of work on qualitative research, curriculum, epistemologies of schooling, professional learning, experiential learning, educational psychology. Here's where I come in right here. So in 1995, I began my PhD at York University, and Evan Thompson is my supervisor. And I learned the enactive approach from Evan Thompson for 3 years, and I began writing chapters of my thesis. But the whole time I'm leading a double academic life, because while I'm learning the enactive approach directly from Evan, and in his PhD seminar classes, and he's supervising my project, at the same time, I immediately begin trying to apply this approach into my teaching and learning. And my heart is really in education. And so I realized this, and I switch my PhD, and I transferred to the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and I started a new PhD. That's the one I defended in philosophy of education. And I began working on the enactive approach. And I was surprised when I began researching to find that what people were calling the enactive approach, I didn't think it was properly an enactive approach. So I began to explore that and look at that, which brings me to, this is an overview of the broad approach, just so you have a sense of how this manifests as a practice in education. So here, learners are reciprocally intertwined with and emergent from interactions with others, that's how they're seen. So Davis uses the enactive concept of structural coupling and complexity theory to argue that mathematical knowledge is neither subjective nor objective, but rather emerges out of shared action. The enactive approach really begins in mathematics, and it begins in science and in science education, and it begins with grade school, so middle school, although my context, of course, is higher education. So it's neither a process nor a product, but mathematical knowledge is like the subject matter of a conversation. It exists only in quote, it exists only in conversing and in its nature. Its structure and its results can never be anticipated, let alone fixed. Enactive education requires a theory of parthood relations in order to describe and explain, quote, collectivities that arise in the co-specifying activities of diverse, relatively independent, dynamic, and interacting agents. Davis drew on an enactive account of selfhood as, quote, tied closely to the co-evolving entities of those around us. He actually begins to do research on involving community in the teaching of mathematics at the grade school level. So he looks at what it means, how does it change education if community and parents are involved in this dynamic process. The broad enactive approach requires teachers and teacher educators to reconceive the practice of teaching by blurring the lines between knower and known, teacher and student, school and community. So in this sense, the expert status in the traditional model of education, or the banking model of education, which I'll talk about in a bit, that traditional status of the educator then gets backgrounded. So Davis and Sumera explain that, quote, learning might be better understood as mutually specifying, co-emergent, pervasive, and evolving practices that are at the core of our culture's efforts at self-organization and self-renewal. So you can see how Davis and Samara are trying to ensure that the community is a part of this entire process. Is that better, Simon? That's slower. Some examples in pedagogy. I'm not going to talk in detail about these. I just want to mention them. The first, Lynn Fels in 1999. She talks about pedagogy. Hers is experiential learning. And I think the context of experiential learning is a very good example of a broad enactive approach. Like it typifies it well, the whole practice and theory of experiential learning. And so I'm going to not talk about these, but just I wanted to show them to you because I have other things I want to move on to, but there are lots of examples in pedagogy about how learning becomes enacted. So that Warren Linz looks at theater of the oppressed and learning emerging in a workshop setting. Michael Cummings looks at hands-on learning, community learning, and calls it hunkering. Hunkering embodies an observation from the interstice, as double embodiment. So an opportunity to see from the spaces that exist between the knower and the known. Lots of examples in qualitative research of this first phase, bringing a fresh set of questions to educational qualitative research. There are some references here. So in what ways are the research participants and the research setting shaping each other? Are they distinct entities or only possible in relation? How do we understand their mutual interaction as research, as knowing, as experiencing? Now I see phase 2 in the enactive approach in education in North America to be a narrowing of the enactive approach, a narrowing towards a complexity view. So Brent Davis is still leading this movement, and he founds with some of his colleagues a journal called an International Journal of Complexity and Education. It's an open source journal that is still available online. It began in 2004. In 2019, it's being reconceived and someone else is taking it over, and it may have a different name moving forward, but all of the issues are archived there, and it's exceptional research, really, and it's all open source. And Brent Davis comes out with 2 books. He has so many books, but 2 books in 2004 and 2006 about complexity and education. At this point, I would say it's probably around 2000 that Brent Davis replaces the term enactivist. He no longer calls himself an enactivist. He calls himself a complexivist. And he says that he sees the two as interchangeable. So that's like around 2000 and around the mid 2000s. By 2010, Brent Davis is saying that he no longer wants to align himself with an enactivist approach. And that I'm going to explain why when I talk about the 2 problem spaces. But in the end, he says that the enactive approach simply cannot account for very important things in education, including social justice and ethics. I don't think this is true, and I don't agree with him. And it took him a number of years to sort of come to that decision. But I don't agree with him on that. And so here's an overview of the much more narrow view. And I really do see much of the research going on as a narrow complexity view. It's still enactivist, but it doesn't realize the potential of an enactive approach in education. So the narrow complexity view aims to foster learning collectives in the classroom by drawing on a number of conditions that complexity science theorists have identified as necessary for complex emergence. I've listed 5 here, and I've just given definitions for 3 that I'll just touch on. And I've given also some articles here that can be looked up. So internal diversity, I'll just briefly mention the first 3. Internal diversity This refers to the fact that any given learning environment or typical classroom consists of a variety of backgrounds, interests, knowledge, abilities, and personalities. The complexity and education scholarship aims to enable this variety to contribute to learning. Then internal redundancy relates to classroom similarities. This is concerned with enabling classroom collectives to dynamically interact and maintain coherence by focusing on a common ground. Then decentralized control, which is the point I brought up about that whole idea of the expert in the banking model, that the lines between educator and learner are being blurred. So that's the first problem space, is this problem space of complexity. And what happens in the journals at the time, I'm just going to finish up that point, and that is to go back to that, that first problem space of the complexity view. And that is that especially in that journal Complicity I was telling you about, there begins to be a rejection of the enactivist approach on these grounds of social justice and ethics, and can it account for that? And certainly Brent Davis by 2011 thought that it couldn't. I don't agree with him. But there's another problem space, and that is a problem space that prevents, I believe, is an obstacle. It's working against realizing in practice the enactive approach in education. So here's a really great book that I wanted to recommend, where these 5 bulleted points, these ideas came from David Damrosch's work in this book, We Scholars, Changing the Culture of the University. In this book, Damrosch argues that the university as an institution is the second most difficult institution to incite change in. So it's the institution that's harder to change than the university is the Catholic Church, he argues. And he has a lot of historical examples about this. And 5 structures of the culture of higher university. And when I call them structures, they're really shared learned behaviors and common to higher education in North America. They're also values that underlie higher education in North America. They are aggressive competitiveness, scholarly isolation, lack of mentoring, disciplinary nationalism, which could be understood as a high degree of specialization, and valuing product over process, valuing grades and the learning product over the learning process. Also, the banking model, which is not talked about in this book, but is really introduced here in Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The banking model, which most of us are familiar with, is the idea, like in this diagram, that the teacher is the depositor, students are depositories, and that teaching is about depositing information into students' heads, and that we have to measure whether they've achieved this learning. And some of you may be thinking, just to shine a light on a possible objection some of you may have at this point, you may be thinking, well, isn't this really, am I really not creating a straw man of education, higher education in North America? And I think absolutely that I'm not, that that the university, for the most part, I teach at York University, it's true of really pretty well every university, that we're expected to show through measurements. We have to have learning objectives. We have to show that we've achieved them, and that when we view our students, the university is presupposing that we see them as disembodied brains. So we're not allowed to see our students as having bodies or having emotions, because this becomes partial. This gets in the way of that learning that's supposed to happen, and the expert is the one who passes that on. So what emerges from these, there's a real dynamics here. What emerges from these, this problem space of higher education, is habits of inattention on the part of faculty and learners, So this is a very lived experience now that I'm talking about. These are emotional habits with emotional stakes, and also myths begin to emerge in higher education. Myths like genuine learning, high quality learning happens in the classroom. We have to replicate the classroom experience online because of that. And that learning is constructed, it's not enacted. That's a myth that that emerges from this problem space. So habits of inattention. These are inscribed habits of inattention, not my term. This is Megan Bowler. This is her book here. She was my PhD supervisor. She describes how emotions are a site of social control. They're a medium, a space in which differences in ethics are communicated, negotiated, and shaped. The imposter phenomenon in higher education is a good example of how this all becomes enacted. So imposter feelings are very widespread among faculty, and imposter feeling is the fear that you're going to be found out, that you don't know what you're talking about. And I've given workshops on the topic all across North America. And I've had faculty members who are just a year away from retiring confess in a workshop setting that they're still afraid that they're going to be found out, that they don't know what they're talking about. And the research goes as far back as what I've seen high school, that these imposter feelings start to emerge. So that's just an example of how these emotions can be enacted, you know, from this problem space of aggressive competitiveness, scholarly isolation, value, and so on. And this really is an obstacle to realizing the potential of the enactive approach. So what might e-learning be, if not self-action or interaction? Well, online learning environments would be seen as ecosystems and incubators, not incubators like a machine, but I'm going to give some examples from my practice in a few minutes of what this looks like. So here I have a continuum moving from self-action through interaction to inaction. That's how I see this practice. So that self-action on the far left is the most traditional model. Here we have our computationalist model. We have a banking model of education that's really centered on the individual, that learning only happens really through self-action. And this continuum also maps on to Dewey and Bentley's distinction between self-action, interaction, and transactions. So then we move along this continuum to interaction, which is somewhere in the middle, starts to be genuinely realized. And interaction really I see as mapping onto constructivism, which has an architecture or building metaphor underlying it, unwittingly mechanical still with these separate entities. And inaction, on moving now to the left on this continuum, holistic, ecological. But I need to say that I don't think we've realized inaction yet. And part of the problem with realizing it, of course, is this problem space back here and these emotional habits. So we're people, all of us in education who are trying to practice an enactive approach are moving along this continuum towards inaction, and the possibilities have yet to be realized. And I think there's a real promise and potential that we can all work together, work towards in our practice. Now, I want to zero in on I can't talk about everything, but I'd like to talk a bit about a dynamical perspective and how it changes everything, and also embodiment. How can embodiment in online learning environments change everything in the way that was demonstrated in that imagination exercise of the ship and the wake. So I'm drawing here on Van Gelder's article, The Dynamical Hypothesis in Cognitive Science. You can see the reference in the bottom here. This is something that Evan Thompson really emphasized in his PhD seminars, that we all really needed to read this and understand this. And here we see, I began with my imagination exercise of space, time, and causality, really that's where everything can be changed with this broad enactive approach. So here we have change, space, two ways of looking at time, operations of systems, process, and interaction. I'm going to instead of going into detail on contrasting the dynamical to a computational perspective, I'm going to just jump right into examples from my practice. So I'll leave you to sort of look at the top parts of the upcoming slides, and I'd like to give examples of practice. So in enactive e-learning, the idea of change becomes completely re-understood. So as we go along that continuum from self-action through interaction to inaction, we are moving from, we are laying down a path and walking, and change is now understood as an evolution, as natural drift, which was the early phrasing in the embodied mind, and Thompson develops enactive evolution. So this is now a structural coupling that takes the focus away from the aggressive competitiveness. So the Darwinian notion of natural selection is not a part of this the enactive view of evolution. So now we have reciprocally adaptive online learning environments. So the examples I'm going to give aren't on this slide because I only have so much time. I'm going to move on. So the first couple, I'm just going to talk about them, but then I want to give examples. So next is geometry versus structure, which I really see is about positioning in space. So here we have highly flexible and customizable e-learning environments that are able to change, and where all the different emergent dynamics in that e-learning environment are customizable and flexible. So choice of mode of delivery, so that students can be taking an e-learning course and they have more control over their learning experience, in the sense that they can actually choose what best couples with their learning styles. If they want to learn by seeing, if they want to learn by hearing, if they if they prefer videos, if they prefer audio podcasts, these are all things that I use and offer in different forms in my e-learning environments, so that students have the option. Do they want to listen to it as a podcast? Do they want to experience it on their phone? Do they, and so on. And different learning styles is about I see the space and the change as working together. So addressing different learning styles, there's also about how much information students can engage with in the environment. So that's another thing. So now structure and time. Time is also looked at differently in an enactive e-learning environment. So time is now in real time, in a sense. It's simultaneously a mutually influencing unfolding of time. So I want to give an example of this. This nonlinear unfolding in real time. It means that that as educators and learners, we can become very surprised about how unpredictable like the places where the learning happens are the places you least expect it. So for example, my office hours, when COVID hit, how I conceived of office hours had to completely change, because office hours were always something that was in a room where a student sat on the other side of a desk. One student came into the office at a time, and I would discuss something with that student would leave, and there'd be a lineup in the hallway of other students who would then come in. That was office hours. Now with COVID and everything being fully online, my office hours evolved into incubator meetings, which was fascinating for me because I did not see that coming. So I had 3 office hours during the week during COVID, and I had to increase my office hours because of the increase in student anxiety that occurred with COVID and the cognitive overload that students experienced during COVID. So what I found was in Zoom, in my office hours, I didn't use the waiting room function. So all the students were in my office hour at the same time. And what happened there was this dynamic co-emergent learning that was really astonishing. And I regret that I didn't record my office hours, but I didn't want to record them because I didn't want some students to feel sort of like they couldn't say whatever they wanted to say because it was being recorded. But moving forward in the fall, I'm not calling my office hours anymore. I'm calling them incubator meetings, and I will be recording them for students who can't be there. So the questions and the co-learning that went on, like between me and all of the students, was just astonishing. And I'm getting close to running out of time. I want to discuss the traditional lecture versus the banking model here. Another thing that gets reconceived in a broad and active approach to e-learning is the traditional lecture. So what is a cutting edge practice right now in e-learning is called chunking. And chunking is where you, instead of having a lecture as such, so I began COVID by trying to give my full lecture like I would in person. I abandoned that for something called chunking. And chunking is where you pre-record short recordings, anywhere from 5 minutes to 10 minutes or 15 minutes, on key things that you want to express, you want the students to engage with. And in chunks, this helps address the embodiment aspect of e-learning, which is the anxiety that students are experiencing and the cognitive overload. These are the two biggest concerns that students have, the experience in their body when they enter an e-learning site. And this just became really a problem at the beginning, right at the beginning of COVID. As soon as everything went online, the anxiety, my student contact time tripled with COVID. And so addressing that anxiety and also the cognitive overload of having an online learning environment. So chunking, having those smaller recordings, also distinguishing, actually telling the student, and I actually use words here, saying, you know, this is necessary, this is important, this is optional. You have to, as an educator, start to let go and be in that place of discomfort where things are constantly changing, and you have to adapt to that. And information, I'll just need a few more minutes. I know it's already 11:16, so just maybe another 4 minutes, and then I'll stop. Information gets completely redefined. And I want to give you 3 examples in my actual practice of how this happens. Information becomes, of course, the information that's been talked about throughout this conference, that Thompson really talks about, the informare, you know, that information isn't something that is an input. It's rather something that is more like a weather front, where you can't point to where it begins and ends, and everything's adjusting and changing reciprocally in time. 3 examples. During COVID, I used a role-playing roundtable simulation game. So I want to suggest that play is something that can help show you how information can be re-understood in a radical way. So I did a roundtable stakeholder simulation, not using any kind of software or anything, just in Zoom, where the topic of the round table was COVID price gouging. This is a business ethics course at the Schulich School of Business at the BBA level, 2nd year course. So all the students are in Zoom. At Schulich, we were required to have real-time lectures, not recordings. So we're all in there. So there's 40 students in Zoom. I broke them up into teams in the breakout rooms in Zoom. And the topic was price gouging. And each of the learning teams in the breakout rooms was a different stakeholder. So whether they were the government, the Ontario government dealing with price gouging and having to pass legislation concerning it, whether they were a company who was doing the price gouging, like a company that manufactures hand sanitizer and then raises the price with COVID. And it was astonishing how this unfolded. Students really relaxed into this, what Professor DePriest was calling that dance, that back and forth really happened there. Another example I'd like to give is an actual simulation that I also did in this course that's through MIT. And it illustrates the tragedy of the commons. And that simulation was a game that students actually played. It's called the fish banks simulation. The fish banks simulation, where students were broken into teams in the fish bank simulation, and they were required to actually fish. So there was a coastal fishery, there was a fishery a little further out, and then there was a fishery that was way into the deep ocean. And everyone experienced and saw the unfolding of the tragedy of the commons. So rather than just telling the student about the tragedy of commons, showing them examples, there was a lived experience of actually being there, doing the fishery and experiencing the fish running out in the deepest place. So I'm running out of time. I want to talk a little bit about embodiment before I stop. And that is, I'm kind of, you would think that embodiment was something that I couldn't show you in an e-learning site as such. And I can't show you my site and then say, look, here's where it all emerged, because I can't point to that. That's something that's happening. But embodiment can be shown to manifest in, for example, the way that an e-learning site is designed, so that the chunking I was telling you about. I'm just going to share my screen briefly with my course site, and then we'll stop and open up into questions. So this is my course site. This is my summer one, which is still active. It's a critical thinking course, and it's in Moodle, which unfortunately is very linear and very constructivist. And this is part of this problem space of what we have to deal with. We're trying to, everyone who's working with the enactive approach in education is trying to create a language to talk about it. And also we have to work with what we've got, practically in practice. So this is my course site, but I want to show you just some little spaces on it. I'll show you briefly my introduction, so which is orientation and introduction, and then also just briefly a lesson on how to diagram arguments. This course is offered through the philosophy department. It's critical thinking. So here we have chunking, and chunking, these are very short messages, and to show you how that looks in a lesson, because this is introductory, here we have a lesson. Notice that the way this is written here actually addresses the student's embodiment and helps to enact learning, because these are all chunked and they're short. And notice I've labeled background, testable, important, optional, testable. This acknowledges the problem space of the culture of higher education in North America. At the same time, it addresses the lived experience of the student, which is anxiety and cognitive overload. So that is helpful there. Notice also how each lesson, rather than everything just being dumped on there, notice that I use these graphic icons to separate out content from resources, from learning activities. This helps the embodiment of the student. It helps reduce student anxiety. I'm currently working on gathering data on how to reduce student anxiety in e-learning. So and learning activities. So I think I'm really have gone way over time, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just stop talking, and we can talk about this.
Thank you very much, Cael.